In January 2024, a truck driver named Carl Messner pulled off the Dalton Highway north of Coldfoot, Alaska. His bunk heater had quit 3 hours earlier. Wind chill was minus 57 degrees Celsius. The nearest mechanic was 240 miles south. But he didn't freeze. He pulled out a kit he'd packed years ago, climbed into his sleeper, and survived 10 hours of Arctic darkness. The driver who found him next morning thought he was pulling up on a dead man. So how do you sleep through a night that cold and wake up alive? To understand why sleeping in Alaska is a survival problem, you first need to understand where these drivers are actually going. The Dalton Highway runs 414 miles from Livingood, just north of Fairbanks, all the way up to Deadhorse on the edge of the Arctic Ocean. It was built in the 1970s to service the Trans-Alaska Pipeline, and it was never really designed for comfort. For long stretches, it's unpaved gravel. There are exactly 3 tiny communities along the entire route: Coldfoot, Wiseman, and Deadhorse. Between those dots on the map, there's nothing but tundra, frozen rivers, and the Brooks Range cutting across the horizon like a wall of white teeth. In winter, the sun disappears entirely for weeks in the northern sections. Temperatures regularly sit at minus 40 to minus 50 Celsius. And when the wind picks up across the north slope, those numbers drop even further. At minus 50 with a 30-kilometer-per-hour wind, exposed skin gets frostbitten in under 5 minutes. Your diesel fuel can start to gel, your brakes can freeze solid, and if your engine dies and you can't get it restarted, you've got a very serious clock ticking against you. This is the environment where Alaskan truck drivers park their rigs and try to get 6 to 8 hours of sleep. Now, the natural question is, why not just keep driving? And the answer is simple. Federal hours of service regulations require long-haul drivers to take a mandatory 10-hour break after driving for 11 hours. On top of that, fatigue on the Dalton is a death sentence all by itself. The road is narrow, icy, and full of steep grades with sheer drops. Driving tired through Adigun Pass in a blizzard at night with a 40-ton trailer behind you is how people end up at the bottom of a ravine. So drivers pull off. They find a wide shoulder or a turnout, they set their brakes, and they try to sleep in what is essentially a metal box sitting in the coldest air on the continent. And that metal box is the first thing we need to talk about. A modern long-haul truck cab is not a tin can. Most of the trucks running the Dalton have sleeper berths built into the back of the cab. Think of it like a very small studio apartment crammed behind the driver's seat. You've got a mattress, usually about 40 inches wide, sometimes a small fridge, some storage cubbies, and if you're lucky, a microwave and a flat-screen TV. The walls have some factory insulation, and there's a curtain that separates the bunk from the cab area to trap heat. But all that factory insulation was designed for the lower 48 states. It was not designed for the north slope of Alaska in January. So the first thing veteran Dalton drivers do is add their own insulation. They cut Reflectix panels, those silver bubble-wrap-looking sheets, and press-fit them into every window in the cab. Some guys glue closed-cell foam mats to the interior walls of the sleeper. A few of the real veterans hang wool blankets across the back wall. Anything to create dead airspace between you and the metal skin of the truck, because that metal is conducting cold straight through like a radiator running in reverse. The single most important piece of equipment for sleeping in an Alaskan truck cab is the auxiliary bunk heater. These are small diesel-fired units, usually Webasto or Espar brand, that burn a trickle of fuel from the main tanks and blow warm air into the sleeper berth. They run independently of the truck's main engine, which means the driver can shut down the big diesel and still have heat all night without burning 4 or 5 gallons of fuel per hour at idle. A good bunk heater uses less than a quarter gallon per hour and keeps the sleeper at a comfortable temperature even when it's horrific outside. But bunk heaters break. They clog. The fuel lines gel in extreme cold. The combustion chambers get carbon buildup. And when your bunk heater quits at 2 in the morning in the middle of the Brooks Range, the temperature inside your cab will start dropping almost immediately. Metal conducts heat out fast. Within 30 minutes, that cab is going to feel like a walk-in freezer. Within 2 hours, it'll be approaching the same temperature as the air outside. This is the scenario that separates prepared drivers from dead ones. Veteran Dalton haulers never rely on just the bunk heater. They build layers of backup, and the way they do it comes down to understanding one basic principle of cold weather survival. You're not trying to heat the air around you. You're trying to keep the heat your body already produces from escaping. A healthy human body at rest generates about 80 watts of heat. That's not nothing. It's roughly the same output as an old incandescent light bulb. The problem is that in extreme cold, that heat gets ripped away from you through conduction, convection, radiation, and evaporation faster than your body can replace it. When your core temperature drops below 35 degrees Celsius, you're hypothermic. Below 30, your heart starts misfiring. Below 28, you lose consciousness. Below 25, your organs shut down. So the whole game, inside that truck cab surrounded by miles of Arctic tundra, is slowing down heat loss. And drivers do it with a system, not a single product. The base layer is the first line of defense. This is the clothing worn directly against the skin, and it has one job: wick moisture away from the body. Sweat is the silent killer in extreme cold. You spend your shift wrestling with chains and tire checks and loading dock work, and by the time you climb into your bunk, your undershirt might be damp. If you sleep in that damp shirt, it'll conduct heat away from your body up to 25 times faster than dry fabric. Veteran drivers always change into fresh, dry base layers before sleeping. Merino wool is the gold standard. It wicks moisture, insulates even when slightly damp, and doesn't develop that stale funk that synthetics get after a few days on the road. On top of the base layer goes the insulating layer. Fleece pullovers, down vests, thick wool socks. The goal is to trap dead air in the fibers of the clothing because still air is one of the best insulators that exists. Some drivers wear fleece balaclavas to bed to keep their head and neck warm, since you can lose a surprising amount of heat through your head if the cab temperature drops overnight. It looks ridiculous, but it works. Then comes the sleeping bag. The serious Dalton drivers don't use a regular camping bag. They use bags rated to -40 or lower. These are usually synthetic filled rather than down, because synthetic insulation keeps working even when it gets damp from breath condensation. The bag gets laid out on top of a closed-cell foam pad, which creates a barrier between the driver's body and the mattress. Without that pad, body heat bleeds straight through the mattress into the metal bunk frame and out into the cold. And then there's one more layer that a lot of experienced cold weather haulers keep in their kit, and it's something that originally comes from emergency survival gear. Thermal bivies. These are compact, lightweight emergency shells with a luminized lining that reflects your body heat back towards you instead of letting it radiate out into the cab. They're basically a personal heat shield. You stuff one into your glove box or under your mattress and forget about it until the night your heater quits. We'll come back to this because what these drivers carry for emergencies might be the most important part of this whole video. But even with all that gear packed into a sleeper berth, there's still the question of how these drivers actually fall asleep. Because the mental side of sleeping in extreme cold is its own challenge. Picture yourself in that sleeper berth. It's the size of a coffin. Outside, the wind is howling across the tundra at 50 kilometers per hour. The truck is rocking on its suspension. You can hear the metal of the frame popping and cracking as it contracts in the cold. And somewhere in the back of your mind, you know that if something goes really wrong tonight, the nearest warm building is a 3-hour drive away. That's not exactly a recipe for peaceful sleep. Veteran drivers have developed routines to deal with this. The first one is a pre-sleep equipment check. Before climbing into the bunk, they do a full walkthrough. Bunk heater running and set to the right temperature. Fuel level check to make sure there's enough diesel to run the heater all night. Backup gear positioned where they can grab it without fumbling in the dark. Emergency satellite communicator turned on and charged. Some drivers keep a carbon monoxide detector clipped to the inside of their sleeper because a malfunctioning heater in a sealed cab can produce CO gas that you'll never smell before it kills you. After the equipment check, a lot of drivers eat a specific kind of meal. High-fat, high-protein food consumed about an hour before sleep. Peanut butter, beef jerky, cheese, sometimes a can of stew heated on a small propane burner or in the microwave. The idea is that digesting fat and protein generates more metabolic heat than carbohydrates, so your body becomes its own furnace through the night. Some old-timers swear by eating a spoonful of coconut oil right before bed. Whether that's real science or trucker folklore is debatable, but the principle of eating calorie-dense food before sleeping in the cold is well documented in Arctic survival training. There's also the breathing trick. In extremely cold air, exhaling inside your sleeping bag warms the space up quickly, but it also dumps moisture into your insulation, which kills its effectiveness. So experienced cold weather sleepers breathe with their mouth and nose outside the bag while keeping the rest of their body sealed in. It takes discipline, because your instinct is to pull that bag over your head and seal up every gap. But long term, keeping your breath out of the bag means your insulation stays drier and works better through the whole night. If you're finding this useful, hit subscribe. We've got a video coming on how engineers keep the Trans-Alaska pipeline from freezing solid, and you don't want to miss that one. Now, what happens when everything goes wrong at the same time? There's a situation Dalton veterans call triple failure, and it's what they all quietly dread. The bunk heater dies. The main engine won't restart because the fuel has gelled or the batteries are too cold to crank, and the weather outside makes it impossible to walk anywhere. You're stuck in a metal box that's losing heat with no engine to warm you, no heater to rely on, and nowhere to go. This is where preparation inside that frozen cab meets real survival. The drivers who make it through triple failure are the ones who built redundancy into their system long before it happened. They have the layering system we talked about. They have chemical heat packs that they can crack and stuff into their sleeping bag, each one producing about 10 hours of low-grade heat. Some carry small butane candles in tin holders. A single candle in a sealed sleeper berth can raise the air temperature by several degrees, which doesn't sound like much until you realize that those few degrees can be the difference between uncomfortable sleep and the onset of hypothermia. And then there's the emergency thermal bivvies we mentioned earlier. This is where they really earn their spot in the kit. The one that keeps coming up in conversations with guys who run these routes is the TerraShell. It uses what they call radiative mirror technology, which bounces about 90% of your infrared body heat back inward, while also blocking wind and moisture from getting through. You can stuff it behind the seat and forget about it for months. But when your bunk heater dies and your engine won't crank and the wind is screaming outside, you pull it out, climb in, and it buys you hours of survivable warmth that you flat out wouldn't have otherwise. A buddy of mine who runs Fairbanks to Deadhorse keeps one in his bunk and one behind the driver's seat. The night he needed it, he was glad it was there. If you want to check it out, there's a link in the description below. Communication is the other critical piece of surviving a breakdown on the Dalton Highway. Most drivers carry satellite communication devices like the Garmin InReach or Spot Messenger. Cell service is non-existent for most of the highway. If you need rescue, your phone is a brick. A satellite communicator lets you send a distress signal to emergency responders with your GPS coordinates. In a triple failure situation, the first thing you do after securing your heat is trigger that beacon. Because even if you can survive the night, you want rescuers moving toward you at first light. The drivers who've been running these routes for 10 or 15 winters develop a mindset that's fundamentally different from the way you or I think about cold weather. For a regular person, extreme cold is something to avoid. For a Dalton veteran, it's something to manage. Like a business partner who's always trying to cheat you. You don't ignore it, you don't fear it, but you never turn your back on it either. One of the most interesting things about long-haul truckers in Alaska is how they talk about cold. Rookies talk about temperature numbers. It was -45 last night. Veterans talk about conditions. The wind shifted northwest and the cab started leaking around the bunk curtain. The difference matters because temperature is just one variable. Wind speed, humidity, whether your clothes are dry, whether you ate enough, whether your heater has been serviced recently, how well your cab is insulated, how much fuel you've got left. All of these factors interact with each other, and the veterans are reading them like a chessboard. They're making adjustments before problems become emergencies. A retired veteran who drove the Dalton for 19 winters once talked about his sleep routine at a truck stop in Fairbanks. He said that by the time he actually closes his eyes, he's already spent 30 minutes preparing. Checking systems, layering up, sealing drafts, setting alarms on his satellite communicator. And he said the preparation itself is what makes sleep possible. You can't fall asleep if you're worried. So you eliminate every reason to worry systematically, and then your body lets you rest. That systematic approach, repeated every night in truck stops and turnouts across the Arctic, is what separates the professionals from the cautionary tales. Every winter, Alaska State Troopers respond to calls involving stranded drivers on the Dalton and the other remote highways. The Elliott Highway, the Stees Highway, the Alaska Highway in the Yukon border region. In most cases, the drivers who get into serious trouble are the ones who were underprepared. They had one heat source and no backup. They were wearing cotton instead of wool. They didn't check their fuel before parking. They assumed the weather would hold or that help was close by. The compounding effect of small mistakes is what kills people in extreme cold. No single error is fatal on its own. But wearing a damp shirt, plus not having a backup heat source, plus parking in an exposed spot where the wind hits the cab broadside, plus not eating enough before sleep. Stack those four together and you've got a situation that can turn lethal in a few hours. The veterans understand this, which is why their approach seems almost obsessive to an outsider. They check everything twice. They carry redundant gear for redundant gear. They know exactly how long their fuel will last at different heater settings. They've memorized the location of every emergency shelter and warm-up hut along their route. And they've made peace with the fact that the environment they work in is genuinely trying to kill them. Not out of malice, but out of pure physics. There's something admirable about people who look at a problem that extreme and solve it through preparation rather than avoidance. These drivers don't have heated garages waiting for them at the end of every shift. They've got a bunk inside a truck on the Dalton Highway, a heater, their gear, and whatever they brought with them, and they make it work, night after night, in temperatures that would stop most people from even stepping outside. The Dalton Highway has been operating as a commercial trucking route since 1974, and in all that time, drivers have been developing and passing down these survival techniques through a kind of informal apprenticeship. Rookies learn from veterans at truck stops in Fairbanks and Coldfoot. Guys who've had close calls share their stories so others don't make the same mistakes. It's not written in any manual. It's a living body of knowledge that exists because the consequences of ignorance are so severe. The next time you turn up your thermostat at home and crawl under a warm comforter, think about the fact that somewhere on the Dalton Highway right now, a truck driver is pulling off the road into total darkness, checking their bunk heater one last time, climbing into a sleeping bag rated for temperatures that would kill an unprotected person in an hour, and closing their eyes for the night. And they'll wake up in the morning, start the truck, and do the whole thing again tomorrow. If this kind of story interests you, we've got a video on screen right now about the engineers who keep the Trans-Alaska Pipeline from freezing solid, and it's even crazier than what you just watched. Click it, and I'll see you there.